The morning sun painted golden streaks across the terminal windows as passengers hurried to catch their early flights. Among them walked Rita Patel, her Louboutin heels clicking confidently against the polished floor of JFK International Airport. At first glance, she looked just like any other successful professional heading out for a business trip. Her navy blue pantsuit perfectly pressed, her leather laptop bag hanging elegantly from her shoulder. Fellow passengers couldn't help but notice her as she made her way to gate B-23. There was something magnetic about her presence, the way she carried herself with such poise and sophistication. Her dark hair was swept into a sleek bun, and her minimal jewelry spoke of expensive taste without being flashy. A young mother struggling with a stroller caught Rita's eye, and without hesitation, she stepped in to help, earning grateful smiles from both mother and child. "Such a kind lady," whispered an elderly passenger to her husband as they watched Rita assist others with their overhead luggage once boarding began. Flight AA 2847 to Chicago was packed that morning, filled with the usual mix of business travelers and tourists. Rita took her window seat in business class, row 5, arranging her belongings with the efficiency of someone who spent half their life in the air. The flight attendants couldn't help but notice her either. She knew their names within minutes of boarding, thanking them personally as they offered pre-flight beverages. "Just water for now, Raj," she said with a warm smile to the senior flight attendant. "I have an important meeting as soon as we land." Her voice carried the polish of expensive education, but there was something approachable about her that made everyone feel at ease. As other passengers settled in, Rita pulled out her phone one last time before flight mode would be required. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen as she appeared to answer a few last-minute emails. A subtle crease appeared between her eyebrows as she read something on her screen, but it vanished so quickly that only the most observant person would have noticed it. The businessman sitting next to her struck up a conversation as the plane began taxiing. "Heading to Chicago for work?" he asked, noticing her professional demeanor. Rita's response was friendly but measured, mentioning something about investment banking and client meetings. Her words painted the picture of a successful career woman, the kind featured in business magazines and 30 under 40 lists. What none of her fellow passengers could have known was that this seemingly perfect flight was about to become the setting for one of the most shocking arrests in banking history. As the plane lifted off the runway, banking through the morning clouds, Rita Patel sat quietly in her seat, the picture of professional success. She even helped the flight attendant distribute blankets to nearby passengers when the cabin got a bit chilly. The irony of her helpful nature would only become apparent hours later. For now, she was just another passenger on just another flight, though her mind was already racing with calculations and contingency plans that would soon turn this routine journey into front-page news. As the plane reached cruising altitude, she pulled out her laptop, the screen's blue light reflecting off her composed face as she began to work on what appeared to be ordinary spreadsheets. Little did anyone suspect that behind that perfectly curated image of success, a storm was brewing. The other passengers, caught up in their own travel routines, reading magazines, watching movies, or drifting off to sleep, had no idea they were sharing cabin space with someone who would soon make headlines across the country. For now, the only sound was the gentle hum of the engines as Flight AA 2847 continued its journey westward through the morning sky. 30 minutes into the flight, the first hairline cracks began to appear in Rita Patel's perfectly maintained facade. Raj Kumar, the experienced flight attendant with 15 years of service, had seen all types of passengers in his career. But something about Rita's behavior caught his trained eye. Subtle changes that most people wouldn't miss, but that stood out to someone who'd spent thousands of hours observing passengers at 35,000 feet. It started with her hands. Those perfectly manicured fingers that had so confidently handled her belongings during boarding now drummed restlessly against her laptop's keyboard. Her typing pattern changed from smooth and professional to erratic bursts, punctuated by long pauses. She'd stop suddenly, stare at the screen, then frantically delete everything she'd just written. The first trip to the bathroom seemed normal enough. Rita politely excused herself, laptop tucked safely in her seat pocket. But when she returned 7 minutes later, her complexion had noticeably paled beneath her makeup. The second trip came just 15 minutes after the first. This time, she clutched her laptop bag against her chest, like a shield, knuckles white against the leather handle. A young couple seated across the aisle exchanged glances as Rita made her third trip in under an hour. "Must be airsick," the woman whispered to her partner, but there was something about Rita's movements that spoke more of panic than illness. Each time she returned to her seat, she seemed to have shed another layer of her polished exterior. The businessman next to her, who had chatted so pleasantly with her during takeoff, now pretended to be absorbed in his magazine. But his eyes weren't moving across the pages, and he shifted uncomfortably whenever Rita's increasingly frequent sighs broke the ambient hum of the cabin. Her perfectly arranged hair had started to come undone, wispy strands escaping from her once immaculate bun. Raj noticed how she jumped slightly every time a phone chimed anywhere in the cabin, her head snapping up to scan for the source of the sound. During the beverage service, her hand trembled so noticeably that some of her water sloshed onto the tray table. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, dabbing at the spill with napkins. "Just a bit of turbulence." But the air was smooth as silk that morning. 2 rows behind, a grandmother traveling with her grandson watched with growing concern as Rita's leg began to bounce rapidly under her tray table. The movement was so intense that the elderly woman could feel the vibration through her own seat. The child, no more than 6, turned around and stared openly until his grandmother gently redirected his attention. Rita's phone had become almost an extension of her hand now, though it was supposed to be in airplane mode. She kept pulling it out, checking for signals, then shoving it back into her pocket with increasing frustration. Her fingers would often drift to her neck, adjusting a pearl necklace that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The laptop screen reflected in the window showed endless rows of numbers, but they weren't the orderly spreadsheets of earlier. These figures scrolled by in a chaotic stream, punctuated by urgent pop-up messages that Rita quickly dismissed. Her eyes darted between the screen and the cabin crew, especially when Raj passed by with his tablet, now making more frequent passes through the business class cabin. What had started as subtle nervousness was evolving into something more obvious. The confident businesswoman who had helped fellow passengers with their bags was dissolving before the crew's eyes. Even passengers who had been doozing began to notice the nervous energy emanating from row 5. The atmosphere around her seat had become a tiny pocket of tension in an otherwise routine flight. As the flight progressed toward its second hour, Rita's transformation continued. Her designer outfit, so crisp at takeoff, had developed small wrinkles from her constant shifting in her seat. She had given up any pretense of working and now sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring straight ahead with an intensity that made other passengers purposely avoid eye contact when passing her row on their way to the restroom. No one could have guessed the magnitude of what was unfolding in that ordinary airline seat, but everyone within a 3-row radius could feel that something wasn't quite right. The perfect passenger from boarding was slowly unraveling, and the real drama was about to begin. 2 hours into the flight, the carefully constructed world Rita Patel had built around herself began to crumble faster than a sandcastle in high tide. Her phone, somehow still receiving notifications despite airline regulations, lit up with a message that made her physically recoil. The businessman beside her couldn't help but notice the string of numbers on her screen. $50 million, followed by a red downward arrow. Rita's breathing became shallow and quick, her chest rising and falling rapidly beneath her expensive blazer. She pulled out her laptop again, fingers flying across the keyboard with desperate energy. The screen reflected in her wide eyes showed a cascade of emails from addresses ending in ch and k, Swiss and Hong Kong banks demanding immediate responses. A young teacher in the row behind glimpsed what looked like transfer confirmations as Rita frantically scrolled through her emails. The numbers were staggering, enough zeros to make anyone's head spin. What caught the teacher's attention wasn't just the amounts, but the timestamp on the transfers, all within the last 24 hours. Raj, the attentive flight attendant, passed by with the snack service. "Would you like anything, ma'am?" he asked, but Rita barely seemed to hear him. Her eyes were fixed on her phone, where a news alert had just popped up. Though she quickly dismissed it, the words "banking investigation" were clearly visible. She declined the snack with a shaky wave of her hand, her wedding ring catching the light as it trembled. The grandmother who had been watching earlier now saw Rita pull out a small leather notebook, its pages filled with handwritten codes and sequences. As Rita flipped through it, a business card slipped out and fluttered to the floor. A helpful child reached to pick it up, but Rita snatched it away so quickly that several nearby passengers turned to look. Her face flushed red as she stuffed the card deep into her bag. More messages kept coming. Rita's phone buzzed so frequently now that it created a constant hum, like an angry bee trapped in her pocket. Each notification seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She checked each one, her face growing paler, her perfectly applied makeup no longer hiding the beads of sweat forming on her forehead. An elderly man across the aisle, a retired banker himself, recognized the look of someone watching their world collapse. He'd seen it before in 08, when the markets crashed and fortunes evaporated overnight. But this was different. This was personal, focused, like watching someone realize they'd been caught in a trap of their own making. Rita's laptop screen now showed multiple chat windows, each one demanding attention. "Where is the ATM?" One message screamed in all caps. Another, more ominous. "Board meeting emergency called. All transactions frozen." She tried to respond, but her trembling fingers kept hitting the wrong keys, leaving trails of gibberish that she frantically deleted. The couple who had been watching her earlier saw her pull up what looked like flight schedules to Dubai, Singapore, and places with no extradition treaties. She toggled between these tabs and her banking screens, her movements becoming more desperate with each click. The pristine professional from takeoff was now visibly falling apart, her composure cracking like thin ice under too much weight. A senior flight attendant walked past, doing a routine cabin check with an iPad in hand. Rita quickly minimized all her windows, but not before several passenger names were visible. Names that matched some of the country's wealthiest families. She clutched her laptop bag closer, her knuckles white against the black leather. The next message that came through was the one that broke her completely. It was from her own bank, a simple notification that made her gasp audibly. All accounts suspended pending federal investigation. She tried multiple times to log into her banking app, but each attempt was met with the same red error message. Access denied. As the flight continued its journey westward, Rita's transformation was now impossible to ignore. The woman who had confidently boarded in New York was gone, replaced by someone on the edge of panic. Her phone kept buzzing, her laptop kept displaying urgent messages, and the weight of whatever was happening seemed to physically push her deeper into her seat. The other passengers, though pretending not to notice, could feel the tension radiating from row 5. Something big was happening, something that would soon turn this routine flight into a story none of them would ever forget. And as the plane flew on through the clear blue sky, no one yet realized they were watching the prelude to one of the biggest financial scandals of the year unfold right before their eyes. The situation reached its boiling point halfway through the flight when Rita's increasingly desperate attempts to stay connected pushed the plane's Wi-Fi system to its limits. She had 3 devices running simultaneously, her phone, laptop, and tablet, each trying to maintain connections with different servers around the world. The plane's internet speed noticeably slowed, causing complaints from other business class passengers trying to work. Raj, the senior flight attendant, received multiple complaints about the wireless connection. As he approached row 5 to investigate, he noticed Rita frantically switching between devices, her once steady hands now shaking as she typed. The screen of her tablet briefly showed what looked like transfer confirmations to numbered accounts, the figures running into millions of dollars. "Ma'am," Raz said gently, "we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our Wi-Fi. Would you mind limiting your connection to one device?" Rita looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, her earlier warmth replaced by barely concealed panic. "I just need 5 more minutes," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "It's a work emergency." The businessman next to her had long since given up any pretense of reading his magazine. He watched as Rita's phone displayed a string of WhatsApp messages from what appeared to be her colleagues. "The auditors are here. Board members calling emergency meeting. Where are you?" Each message seemed to increase her agitation. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the captain received an unusual message from ground control. A major investment firm in New York had contacted the airline directly, urgently trying to locate one of their senior executives. The description matched Rita perfectly. The captain relayed this information to his crew while maintaining a calm demeanor to avoid alarming the passengers. Back in the cabin, Rita's attempts to manage her crisis were becoming more obvious to everyone around her. Her laptop screen showed multiple bank websites, each displaying error messages about blocked accounts and suspended access. She attempted to override these blocks using what looked like administrative passwords, but nothing seemed to work. The retired banker across the aisle noticed something odd about the numbers flying across her screen. Having spent decades in finance, he recognized the telltale signs of someone trying to cover their tracks. Account numbers were being deleted, transferred, and altered in rapid succession. He discreetly pressed his call button, feeling a moral obligation to alert the crew. A young tech professional seated 2 rows behind Rita noticed that she was using sophisticated VPN software to mask her location. Every few minutes, her IP address would bounce to a different country: Hong Kong, Switzerland, Cayman Islands. He mentioned this quietly to a flight attendant who was already keeping a close eye on row 5. The atmosphere in the business class cabin grew increasingly tense. Rita's anxiety was becoming contagious, spreading like an invisible cloud through the surrounding rows. Passengers exchanged worried glances as she became more frantic, her composed corporate image completely shattered. The head flight attendant received word from the cockpit about the situation. She watched as Rita attempted to access the plane's Wi-Fi using what appeared to be hacked premium access codes. Each failed attempt seemed to drive her closer to the edge of despair. Her designer outfit, impeccable just hours ago, was now wrinkled and damp with stress. Ground control updated the captain again. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was now involved. They had traced suspicious transactions totaling over $50 million to multiple offshore accounts, all executed within the past 24 hours. The activities matched the pattern of a sophisticated embezzlement scheme they'd been tracking for months. Rita seemed to sense the walls closing in. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications from news apps. Headlines about a major financial investigation were beginning to appear. She tried to access her company email one last time, only to find her account had been deactivated. The message on the screen was clear: account suspended by administrator. The other passengers, though pretending to focus on their own activities, couldn't help but witness this unfolding drama. The woman who had so kindly helped others with their bags during boarding was now mumbling to herself, her fingers trembling as she tried one last desperate attempt to access her accounts. As the plane began its initial descent into Chicago, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Rita's devices kept pinging with messages she could no longer access. Each notification sounded like another nail in the coffin of her crumbling career. Little did the passengers know that their routine flight was about to become the scene of one of the most dramatic arrests in banking history. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. For most passengers, it was a routine announcement, but for Rita Patel, those words seemed to trigger something close to desperation. Her perfectly maintained exterior had completely crumbled, replaced by raw panic that she could no longer hide. The view outside showed the sun setting over Chicago's iconic skyline, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. But Rita wasn't admiring the view. Instead, she was furiously deleting files from her devices, her fingers moving with such speed that they frequently missed their intended targets on the keyboard. The businessman next to her couldn't help but notice how she kept glancing at the flight progress map on her screen, watching their altitude numbers steadily decrease. 20 minutes to landing, announced the flight attendant, and Rita's breathing became even more erratic. She pulled out a small makeup mirror, attempting to fix her appearance, but her hands shook so badly that she dropped it. The mirror clattered to the floor, cracking slightly, a fitting metaphor for her rapidly shattering world. The grandmother who had been watching the situation unfold reached down to help pick up the mirror pieces. As she did, she caught a glimpse of Rita's phone screen. News headlines about a massive financial investigation were now trending. The elderly woman quietly showed her grandson a game on her tablet, trying to distract him from the obvious distress of the passenger in front of them. Raj, making his final cabin check, noticed Rita attempting to access the airplane's Wi-Fi one last time. Her laptop screen flickered between multiple windows, email accounts being closed, files being deleted, and chat windows filling with increasingly urgent messages. One message particularly caught his eye. "They know everything. FBI involved." The retired banker across the aisle watched as Rita pulled out a stack of documents from her laptop bag, quietly tearing them into tiny pieces. She tried to be discreet about it, but in the confined space of an airplane cabin, such actions rarely go unnoticed. The pieces disappeared into her empty water cup, turning the remaining drops of water into a murky soup of dissolving paper. As the plane descended through 10,000 feet, the reality of her situation seemed to hit Rita full force. She began quickly changing her passwords on various accounts, her fingers trembling as she typed. The young tech professional seated behind her noticed she was using increasingly complex combinations of numbers and symbols, like someone trying to lock every door before a storm. The cabin pressure changed as they descended, causing ears to pop, but Rita seemed oblivious to the physical discomfort. She was lost in her own world of digital destruction, systematically erasing what looked like years of carefully maintained records. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications, each one causing her to flinch as if being physically struck. A flight attendant passed through with a final water service, but Rita didn't even look up. Her focus was entirely on her devices, desperately trying to cover her digital tracks, even as the plane's wheels prepared to touch Illinois soil. The documents she couldn't destroy were buried deep in her carry-on bag, tucked between the pages of fashion magazines and expense reports. The couple who had been watching her since takeoff noticed how she kept touching her neck, adjusting her pearl necklace like it was slowly choking her. Her designer blazer, which had looked so crisp in New York, was now wrinkled and damp with anxiety. She had long since kicked off her expensive heels under the seat, her stockinged feet tapping an endless rhythm of nervous energy on the airplane carpet. Through the window, the lights of Chicago grew larger and brighter. Each approaching light seemed to increase Rita's panic. She tried one last time to access her company email, only to find every account locked. The message was clear. There was no going back. The world she had carefully built over years of climbing the corporate ladder was dissolving faster than the torn papers in her water cup. As the landing gear deployed with a heavy thunk, Rita finally gave up on her devices. She sat back in her seat, staring straight ahead, her face a mask of resignation. The other passengers fastened their seatbelts and returned their tray tables to their upright positions, going through the normal motions of landing while trying not to stare at the woman who looked like she was preparing for her own execution. None of them knew exactly what was waiting at the gate, but they could sense that this flight's ending would be anything but ordinary. As the Chicago skyline drew ever closer, Rita Patel, once the picture of corporate success, sat in quiet defeat, awaiting the moment when the plane's doors would open and her fate would be sealed. The plane touched down at O'Hare International Airport with a gentle bump, its wheels kissing the runway as the evening sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. For most passengers, this would be just another landing, but the atmosphere in the cabin told a different story. The usual rustling of people gathering their belongings was replaced by an unusual stillness, as if everyone could sense what was about to unfold. Rita Patel sat motionless in her seat, her earlier frantic energy replaced by an eerie calm. Her hands, which had been desperately deleting files just minutes ago, now lay still in her lap. The businessman next to her pretended to read the safety card, uncomfortable with the heavy silence that had settled between them. As the plane taxied to the gate, Raj, the senior flight attendant, received a discreet message through his earpiece. His professional smile never wavered, but his eyes darted quickly to row 5. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but this time with an unusual addition. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we've reached our gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. We have a special security procedure to follow today." The word security seemed to hang in the air. Rita's shoulders tensed visibly, though she kept staring straight ahead. The grandmother behind her quietly pulled her grandson closer, sensing the gravity of the moment about to unfold. Other passengers exchanged glances, pieces of the puzzle they'd witnessed during the flight starting to come together. Through the windows, passengers could see several dark SUVs with tinted windows parked near the gate, their government plates visible even from a distance. Men in suits stood waiting, their earpieces and stern expressions marking them clearly as federal agents. This wasn't the usual welcome wagon for a domestic flight. The plane came to a complete stop. The seatbelt sign remained on, contrary to the usual routine. Rita's phone buzzed one final time, a message that made her close her eyes briefly, accepting what was coming. The retired banker across the aisle noticed a single tear roll down her cheek, smudging her expensive mascara. Moments later, 3 FBI agents boarded the plane. They moved with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing in the unusually quiet cabin. The lead agent, a woman with gray streaked hair pulled back in a professional bun, spoke quietly with the flight attendant, who nodded toward row 5. The cabin was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. Every passenger sat still, many pretending to look at their phones while actually watching the scene unfold through their peripheral vision. The young teacher, who had noticed Rita's suspicious behavior earlier, was now recording everything in her memory, knowing she'd be telling this story for years to come. "Miss Patel," the lead agent spoke clearly but not uncannily, "we need you to come with us." Rita looked up, her face a mixture of resignation and relief, as if the weight of running had suddenly been lifted from her shoulders. She nodded once, gathering her belongings with shaking hands. The businessman next to her shifted uncomfortably to let her pass, avoiding eye contact but unable to completely hide his fascination with the unfolding drama. Rita stood slowly, her designer outfit now wrinkled from the hours of nervous fidgeting, her perfect bun coming undone. The other 2 agents flanked her as she walked down the aisle, their movements professional and practiced. There was no resistance, no dramatic scene, just the quiet click of handcuffs being fastened around her wrists, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the silent cabin. Her Louboutin heels, which had clicked so confidently through JFK that morning, now stumbled slightly on the carpet. As they led her toward the exit, Rita held her head high, though her face had lost all color. The same passengers she'd helped with their bags during boarding now watched in stunned silence as she was escorted off the plane. The young mother whose stroller she'd helped with covered her mouth in shock, while her baby slept peacefully, unaware of the drama. The tech professional who had noticed her VPN usage earlier whispered to his seatmate, "I knew something wasn't right." But there was no triumph in his voice, only the sobering realization that they had all witnessed someone's life change forever in the span of a single flight. As Rita disappeared through the aircraft door, the cabin remained unusually quiet. The sun had almost set now, its final rays casting long shadows through the windows. The other passengers sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. The arrest of a seemingly successful businesswoman, the end of what would soon be revealed as one of the biggest financial scandals of the year. The morning after the dramatic arrest on Flight AA 2847, newspapers across the country splashed Rita Patel's story across their front pages. The businesswoman who had helped fellow passengers with their luggage was now the face of a financial scandal that sent shockwaves through Wall Street. Coffee shops buzzed with conversations about the high-flying investment banker who had fallen from grace at 35,000 feet. Many of the passengers who had witnessed the arrest found themselves glued to their TV screens and phones, watching the story unfold. The grandmother who had observed Rita's breakdown called her daughter, a bank teller, to share what she had seen. "She looked just like any other successful person," she said, her voice still carrying traces of disbelief. "You'd never know she was carrying such a heavy secret." The retired banker, who had noticed the suspicious transactions during the flight, was interviewed by several financial news channels. "The signs were there," he explained, choosing his words carefully. "The rapid account transfers, the offshore connections. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion." His insights helped many understand how someone could orchestrate such an elaborate scheme. Details emerged about the scope of the embezzlement. Over $50 million had vanished from high-net-worth client accounts. The money had been carefully siphoned off over months, hidden behind complex international transfers and fake investment reports. Rita's clients had included celebrities, tech entrepreneurs, and old money families who had trusted her with their fortunes. The young tech professional who had spotted her VPN usage found himself explaining to colleagues how she had covered her digital tracks. She was bouncing her signal through different countries, he said during a lunch break discussion. It was clever, but in the end, technology left a trail that couldn't be erased. His explanation ended up in several tech blogs, breaking down the digital breadcrumbs that led to her capture. The flight attendant, Raj, received a commendation from the airline for his attentive service and observation skills. In the crew break room, he shared how he had noticed the small changes in her behavior. "It's not just about serving drinks," he explained to a new hire. "Sometimes, our job is about paying attention to the little details that don't quite add up." Rita's former office building became a magnet for news vans and reporters. Her colleagues, still processing the betrayal, shared stories of her generosity. Holiday gifts for the cleaning staff, mentoring junior employees, organizing fundraisers for local charities. "That's what makes it so hard to understand," one coworker told a reporter. "She seemed to care about people. She was the last person you'd expect to do something like this." Inside the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, investigators pieced together the puzzle. Rita's scheme had been brilliant in its simplicity. She had exploited her clients' trust and her firm's reputation to create a sophisticated digital shell game. But like all such schemes, it had required constant maintenance, a house of cards that needed endless attention to keep from collapsing. The business class cabin of Flight AA 2847 had become part of financial crime history. The airline received so many requests for those exact seats that they had to release a statement asking people to stop specifically booking row 5. The businessman who had sat next to Rita even sold his story to a magazine, describing how he had witnessed her final moments of freedom. In the courthouse where Rita's case was being heard, the young mother she had helped with the stroller at JFK showed up to watch the proceedings. When asked by a reporter why she came, she replied thoughtfully, "I guess I wanted to understand how someone could be so kind one moment and be carrying such a burden the next. It makes you wonder about the masks we all wear." The story became a cautionary tale in business schools and banking seminars. Professors used it to teach about ethics and the pressure of maintaining appearances in the high-stakes world of finance. The real lesson, one professor told his students, isn't just about financial controls. It's about the human capacity for both deception and redemption. As the legal proceedings continued, the grandmother from the flight kept the newspaper clipping about the arrest. She would show it to her grandson when he was older, she decided, as a lesson about how life isn't always what it seems. Sometimes, she would tell him, the most important things happen in the most ordinary places, like a regular flight on a regular day, when nobody's expecting anything extraordinary at all.